What is this thing? It's pretty obvious that it's called a 3DS-EXP, but apart from that, I haven't got a clue. I've got no idea where it came from, no idea how it operates, no idea what the photos are like out of it, and also no idea if it even works. It was lent to me by my mate Howard, who's been selling analog cameras for well over a decade, and even he was stumped by this thing. Thankfully though, there's this thing called the internet with the collective knowledge of mankind to help me work this out. So I punched this camera's name into Google to see what it had to say about it, and nothing. The best it had to offer were a couple of photos from some auctions that took place years ago, and an old Facebook Marketplace ad where someone was trying to flog one of these things. Apart from this, it was just giving me search results for handheld Nintendo consoles and printer ink cartridges, and I'm pretty sure this is neither of those. So with no instant information about this camera, it looks like we're gonna have to work it out on our own. So what have we got? Well, the first thing you'll notice, and you have to look closely because it's quite a subtle detail, is that this camera has 6 lenses. No, this isn't a f*** up at the camera factory, this is on purpose. This is because, as best as I can guess, this camera was built for taking lenticular photos. Multiple lenses all fire at the same time, capturing the exact same moment but at slightly different angles. So when you mash all these photos together, you get a 3D effect. Lenticular prints change depending on which angle you view them at. Like this one, which is a bad example, but the cheapest on eBay, so that's the best you're gonna get. Annoyingly, on video, you can't really get the full 3D effect, so you, unfortunately, are just gonna have to take my word for it when I tell you these cute little kittens are living it up in the 3rd dimension. Lenticular prints are a whole rabbit hole in of itself, and they work by a combination of witchcraft and blood rituals, or something like that. I don't know, that's not what this video's about. But you may have seen cameras like this before, such as the Nimslo 3D and the Nishika N8000. These cameras have become pretty popular over the years because instead of using them to make stuffy old lenticular prints, people have dragged these cameras kicking and screaming into the digital age because it turns out they're quite good at making GIFs. So this camera is like this camera, except it isn't, because it isn't shit. So this camera has 5 taking lenses instead of 4. More lenses means more images, making your GIF run more longer. It also has actual controls. These other ones are essentially point and shoots. The Nimslo picks your exposure automatically for you, and the Nishika's lazy ass can't even be bothered to do that. But the 3DS-EXP has a whole range of controls for you to get wrong. We've got multiple shutter speeds from 1/500th of a second all the way down to 16 seconds. Those are some good numbers, there's some tasty digits in there. With aperture control as well. The fastest is 5.6, which, you know, that's not very fast at all. But this camera has a lot on its plate, so we'll let it off. This camera also has 2 knobs. The one on the right is for manual focusing, and the one on the left is for locking it in place. It's also surprisingly well built. It doesn't feel like it's going to fall apart in my hands, unlike the Nishika, which I'm pretty sure is just held together with pure willpower alone. The viewfinder also works like a TLR, or twin lens reflex, where you have one lens for viewing the image and then another lens that actually takes the photo. Except this is 6 lenses, so it's a sextuplet lens reflex, so really you could call it an SLR? Don't think about it too much. The other cool thing about this viewfinder is that it has its own aperture control, which is great for helping you not only judge depth in a photo, but if you really hate your composition, then you can roll that all the way up to f45, and likelihood is you won't have to look at it anymore. But the big difference with this camera, compared to the more common 3D cameras that you see, is what you load it with. Whereas something like the plastic abomination that is the Nishika takes 35mm film, this massive fella is medium format 120 roll film, shooting 5 images for each individual photo. So the idea of a camera churning out 3D images on a medium format negative size is truly exciting. Its 35mm counterparts are pretty shitty quality really when you boil it down, especially after you've spent 3 hours in Photoshop screaming, cropping them into oblivion and trying to make them line up properly. So a medium format version of this whole process is not only going to produce a sharper image, but theoretically make it easier to put together. All of these points sound amazing until you realise what a catastrophic effect it's going to have on your wallet. As for every roll of 120 film that you feed this thing, it will produce you 2 final photos. 2. So in the UK, a roll of colour film is 10 to 20 quid, with developing and scanning being roughly £15 on top of that, which means if you don't do any of the developing or scanning yourself, each finished photo out of this thing could cost you north of £10 each. And that's if the camera's working properly. Just a little bit of subtle foreshadowing for you there. So this camera is from Japan, and if you would like to get your hands on your own camera gear from Japan, then now you can, thanks to this week's sponsor, Buyee. There are some items that are just too difficult or too expensive to buy outside of Japan, and this is where Buyee can help. Buyee is a service that can place orders or bid for you on Japanese auction or shopping sites. This includes sites like J-Direct Items, Mercari, Rakuten, and many more. They have the item shipped to them, and then they ship it to you, which means that you can avoid some price hikes and get your hands on items that the Japanese sellers don't want to ship internationally. They ship worldwide, including North America and Europe, with loads of different shipping methods and lots of payment attachment methods so you can find the right one for you. Buyee is super easy to use and has support in several different languages. So if you're in the market for some new Japanese camera gear, then check out Buyee and maybe get a good deal on some new items. Also, if you sign up using the link in the description, then Buyee will give you a coupon for 10% off your first purchase to help you out. Right, back to this camera. So how do we actually use this camera? I mean, it doesn't look too complicated, right? It's just a shutter button and a shutter speed dial and this random button and this lever and this mystery switch that I can't work out. Well, just to be safe, I set about finding the instructions for this camera, which apparently is the unicorn of all camera manuals and has been totally eradicated from existence. The very small amount of literature that came with this camera was all branded Image Tech, which might make you think that they actually made this thing, considering they have made 3D cameras before and they're involved in the whole lenticular print process. But it looks like they are just putting their name on someone else's homework, because the maker's mark on the bottom of this camera is Sakai Special Camera MFG Co. Limited. Finally, a lead. Someone that might be able to shed some light on this situation. Someone that can provide some much needed information about this camera, and they went bust in 2002. On the upside though, like, we got a rough age of this thing. So I expanded my search, looking up the world's finest experts in the field of lenticular photos. All of them were either just completely ignoring me, were retired, or had websites so dated that their latest contact information were fax machine numbers. I bet some of you don't even know what a fax machine is. I even went out and visited some well-respected film camera shops who told me that they had never seen this before and I should get out of the shop and put my trousers back on. It seemed like I was never going to get any information, or more importantly, an instruction manual for this camera, and I was going to have to work it out on my own. Until I noticed this. On one of the auction site's photos from a previously sold camera, some absolute big brain genius had the bright idea of printing out a set of instructions and gluing it to the back of the camera. It's like they knew I would need this scrap of paper to tame this machine in the future, like some sort of boring rejected script for a Terminator movie. These instructions are quite intriguing themselves. Preferably use 220 film, which is a great start because that film format is pretty much non-existent these days. Never, in quotation marks and triple underlined, switch off the camera during a roll. I'm sure that if I did, it would just ruin the roll of film that's in it. But with 2 exclamation marks, I'm now concerned that if I do turn the camera off, it's going to vaporize the Earth's atmosphere or something heinous. There is also a sequence to follow when you're shooting the camera, with various steps like cock, which is underlined, so that seems pretty important. Someone has also added don't cock in a different pen at some point, like they're a teacher marking someone's terrible work. There's some nonsense about always doing a test shot or something far too sensible. And lastly, a bunch of numbers and stuff which look important and boring, and we're going to completely ignore that because last time I checked, numbers are for math and photography is art. So we have instructions, sort of, on how to operate this thing, so we can boot it up and start taking some photos. Except no, we can't. If you've been unfortunate enough to have had any experience with film cameras, then you've probably noticed that pretty much all of them seem to run on small disposable batteries. Even the mega late film cameras, like this late Canon, which can run on 8 AA's. That's like 16 A's. But this thing is sort of an exception, because whatever smarty pants put it together made it so it runs on a rechargeable remote control car battery. So I took the battery that came with it and threw it on charge, and it then proceeded to become the hottest thing on the planet. Now, I'm no expert on batteries, but I'm pretty sure they're not supposed to become hotter than the inside of a McDonald's apple pie when you charge them. But that's alright, because I can just pop out and get another one, right? That's sarcasm, if you didn't clock that. So there we go, back to the fucking internet to find a 30-year-old battery which apparently has an electrical connector which only exists on this one bloody battery. A day searching, 3 emails, 2 phone calls, and 50 quid later, and here it is. Let's stop chatting shit, let's plug it in, and let's go shoot this camera. Loading this camera is much like loading any other medium format camera. You take the previous spool out and you swap it over to the other side, then you take your fresh film and you put it into the camera, and then you drag the film leader for 2 to 3 business days over to the other side of the camera. And it turns out this little button on top actually spins the take-up spool, which is quite a nice feature really, and turns the whole process into some twisted game of chance, tapping the little button in hopes that you can get it facing the right way. And then this brings us onto our first issue with this camera. The film door doesn't close all the way, and this camera is smart enough that it won't fire unless it is. Now, I could just go crazy and cocoon this thing in tape, but it doesn't really give the amount of pressure that I need, so ultimately the best way around this is to just hold the door closed. And you better hope that it stays closed, because if it opens even slightly, it resets the whole camera and essentially just wastes the roll of film that it's loaded with. So the broken door, combined with the fact that the new battery doesn't fit, on top of the fact that this camera is the size of a Labrador doesn't really make this the most nimble of cameras. Definitely not something you can just throw in your bag in hopes of capturing candid moments. When you're all loaded up though, operating this thing is actually pretty easy. You push the shutter button, wait for the camera to advance to the first frame, cock, take your photo, and then cross your fingers and pray that the camera has enough mercy not to show you the H error message. Now obviously this isn't standard, it's just an issue with this particular copy, and really it only does it about half the time, but essentially H stands for how about no, and you're only going to get one photo out of your roll that's cost you roughly between 20 to 30 pounds. On a side note, when I flicked the mystery switch, the camera doesn't advance to the next frame. Maybe it's for double exposures, maybe firing the lenses in sequence instead of simultaneously. Either way, this feature is more inconsistent than my upload schedule. So, like all of us, this camera has some issues, and seeing as I have no chance of just going out and buying a fully working one, as well as repair shops saying that they don't really have any idea how long it would take to fix, I decided that the best slash most impatient thing to do is to crack on anyway. But before I load some expensive colour film, I decided to test it with some Kentmere 400 because it's good and more importantly, it's cheap. I then called upon my beautiful assistant to help me out, but unfortunately, she wasn't available and I had to ask my girlfriend instead. I think she'll like that joke, I'm not sure. We then went out and fired off a couple of test shots, like this one, with plenty of foreground to try and exaggerate that 3D effect, and also this one of me holding a golf club for some reason. But if you look at these side by side, you might notice something. Her photo runs slightly longer, and that's because it's made up of 5 images and mine is made up of 4. And this is because one of the lenses, every now and then, is not being a team player and deciding to underexpose its shot. One of mine was so underexposed I just didn't use it, and for hers you can see it's causing this slight flicker. This isn't the only strange thing it does though. In this set, in one of the frames, it's just made Fran completely disappear. I'm guessing these lenses have individual shutters and one of them decided to fire well after she'd left the frame. Either that or it's some sort of Goosebumps say cheese and die situation where the camera's predicting the future where she's left me. Might actually come true if I keep making these shit jokes. These photos are fine, but you could take something similar with one of the other 3D cameras, and this camera shits on them in terms of features and controls. So instead, I decided to test it by taking the treacherous journey into my back garden at night. I'm not going to go too far, this thing is a proper mission to lug around. I grabbed a couple of flashes, got a couple of rolls of Kodak Gold while it's still cheap, really Kodak, then made good use of the wide variety of shutter speeds on this camera by setting it to 16 seconds and ran around in the night time flashing my misses. Thankfully for these shots, the camera decided it wanted to be friends and magicked itself better and didn't have any issues. And yeah, these photos might not look like much, but they do demonstrate how capable this camera is. In the right hands, it could create some crazy work. Not my hands, someone talented. And this is probably one of the few cameras out there where you can capture an image like this on film. And you would have a very hard time trying to do it on one of the other 3D cameras that we're used to seeing. But I think one of the craziest things about this camera isn't the images that it could produce, but the fact that it must have taken a team of people to dedicate their time, hours and hours of research and design, and then a huge amount of effort to actually produce the thing, for it to essentially be forgotten and fall into obscurity. If you have any information on the 3DS EXP, then please fill in all the gaps below, put me out my misery. Good work guys, well done. Especially me, you were fine.